Hi everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at DxO's popular application PureRaw. And as of this video, we're up to version 3.3. And version 3 introduced a lot of enhancements to the workflow, a refresh to the interface. We can also have more control over the DxO optics module for sharpening and vignetting, etc. And we can also now output to 16-bit TIFF files. And then finally, they introduced the DPrime XD, which allows you to squeeze just a little bit more extra detail out of your files. Now in this video, I'm going to be covering the new enhancements to the workflow when you're batch processing your images. Also, I'm going to go over these settings in the DxO Optics module, and then I'll give you a few examples and tips on how to get the best out of your images. Now there's essentially three ways you can use DxO PureRaw. You can use it as a standalone app as I've opened up here, or you can use it as a plugin to Lightroom Classic, or you can even directly access and process images from your file manager on your computer. So let's start working with DxO PureRaw as a standalone app, because this is where you'll see most of the enhancements to the overall workflow. Now, just as before, you can simply add images by clicking the plus icon here, navigating to your directory, then selecting the images that you want to process and click add. You also have the option to navigate, say, maybe to a different directory, and then adding the files by just simply dragging and dropping. Now you may get a message that pops up like this telling you that it's not able to add this file for processing, and that's because most likely it's not a true raw image from your camera. PureRaw can only process raw images straight from the camera like .orfs, .nef. It can even process .dngs, but in this case the DNG file is not a true raw image from my camera, but it's actually a panel that I stitched together in Photoshop and just saved it as a DNG, and that's why I got this message. So be conscious of that. You're not going to be able to do JPEGs or TIFFs or any other kind of file format. You can only process true raw images from your camera. All right, so let's click OK. And then the next thing that might pop up is the DxO Optics module window. And this is going to ask you, do you want to download the optics module for the images that came in, or do you want to not use any of the optics module? And then sometimes you get prompted with two different choices for a lens that's very similar. This is very rare, but in my case, this happened when I imported images that use the Olympus 40-150 kit lens, the f4 to f5.6, and it was asking me, do I want to use version 1 or version 2? And I happen to have version 2 of that lens, so that would be the DxO Optics module I download. But it's very rare, like I said, but be conscious of that. It may come up, and you need to be very specific about the lens that or optics module that's going to be applied. And you'll also notice here that it says that I've already downloaded this particular optics module, so I won't have to do that again. But if you are going to download optics module, you would just click on save, and then it may take a minute or two for it to update the images in the what they call the light box here. But once that's done, you can start working with the images. All right, so let's go back to a full screen, and now we're presented with what they call the light box, and this is where you can kind of organize your images. Right now I have them sorted by ISO or group by ISO. So these images at the top here are over 1600 ISO. These are between 400 and 1600, and these are all under 400. So it's possible you may not even want to process images below ISO 400. Personally, I like to process all my images regardless of ISO, mainly because I think it does a superior job in demosaicing the images than any other processing software out there, so I get better quality. But also, say, if you look at this image right here, that's a little bit dark. If I bring this into post-processing and try and raise the shadows, I'm going to see noise in the shadow areas regardless of ISO. So if I pre-process them to here in PureRaw, it's going to eliminate a lot of that noise, if not all of it. Now you can organize the photos not just by ISO, but by date or by name. You just go up to the sort icon up here, and I can click on date. So now they're sorted by date. If I wanted to reverse the order, because right now it's chronologically the oldest to the newest, I can just click on date again, and it'll reverse the order of the sort. And of course, you can do the same thing with name, and then reverse it by name. I like to do it by ISO, just so I can kind of get a feel for the kind of images I'm going to be processing, what their ISOs are. But you do whatever works best for you. Now you may have noticed that after sorting, none of the images are selected. So I can just go back and select them individually like this, or I can just do Control A on my keyboard, and this will select them all at once. And down here, you'll see an add to queue, and you'll see process now. So I can start processing right now, because when I selected these, they automatically get added to the queue. The time when you use this add to queue button is when you've already started processing some images and then you start adding more. Maybe you're dragging more images from a different folder into the Lightbox, and then you sort and select or call those, and then you can add those to the queue. Now, before we start processing, I want to take you over to the File and Preferences menu and make sure everything is optimized here. So, of course, English will be my preferred language. And then under D prime acceleration, you may have an auto selection here, which I have in my case, where it's going to automatically select a compatible graphics card in your computer and optimize the processing for D prime. So it's going to process the images a lot faster if you do have a dedicated graphics card. And then below that, you may have several graphic cards in your computer, in which case you want to select the fastest one that you have, and you'll know what it is if you have it. And then finally, there's use CPU only. And really, the only time you need to use this is possibly when you have a maybe a brand new graphics card with new drivers that are not compatible with PureRaw 3. So even if PureRaw 3 automatically selects it and thinks it's compatible, you may see some artifacts or some weird things in your denoised image, like a pink cast or possibly, some artifacts and blocking. So that's when you would use CPU only. Another scenario is, I believe on the Apple machines, I was told that the people were seeing a certain color cast in their images when they selected the Apple Neural Engine. Now, with the update version 3.3, supposedly that's been corrected. So let me know in the comments below if that's the case, because I don't have an Apple computer. But there are reasons you may want to do CPU only, but for most of us out there, I think you can just use the auto selection. And then finally, there's a tick box here for processing technologies, and it says show legacy processing methods like high quality and prime. And I always deselect this, because if you have D prime and D prime XD available, there's really no reason to use the older technology. So let's go ahead and click save and then start processing. So let's go ahead and hit process now. And then you're presented with this dialog box, and there's a few new things here. So let's start at the top. We're going to process 15 photos. I'm going to choose D prime as my processing engine. And then we have our optical corrections here. And this is where I said you could turn on and off certain things in the optics module. And there are reasons you want to do that, and I'll get to that later. And then we have our output format. And this is new. The TIFF is a new output format available to us. This is the one I recommend you use. But make sure this is set to 16-bit so you get the highest quality image. Now, you can't select the other ones at the same time. And in this case, you'll get three files output, a DNG, a JPEG, and a TIFF. And, JPEG, if it's pretty much done straight out of camera and you just want to process and share it, you can just output a JPEG, I guess. And then DNG is a RAW format. You're not going to be able to reprocess it again, but some people like to use DNGs. I guess they have some more flexibility. But for me personally, I recommend, or I always use TIFF, because just about every processing or editing software out there is able to use a TIFF file. And give you an example, like DxO's own NIC collection can only process using TIFF files or JPEG files. And of course, you want to use TIFF files, and you'll be able to start editing using the NIC collection right away if they're already in a TIFF format. Otherwise, you'd have to convert it from, say, DNG to TIFF in Lightroom or whatever. All right, and then we have our destination. Generally, you want to save the images back to their original folders, and then even better, put them into a subfolder labeled DxO in this case. Now, for the video, I'm just going to put them into a custom folder here called PureRaw 3, and I can, of course, browse and select the folder that I want to put them into. And then just below that, you have a file renaming options where you can add a prefix or a suffix, something before and after the original file name. And I don't like to use the default here raw processing method, for example, because it's just very long. It says DxO D prime XD. I just use my own custom text and just put abbreviated XD. And then for the suffix, I like to put in the sharpening method that I used. In this case, I'm using soft, so that'll be my custom text there. And then finally, you have the export. Now, I selected do not export after processing. What that means is, and let me show you the options here, you can export to Lightroom, or you can go to Photoshop, or you can select a specific software like Affinity or Capture One or whatever software that can accept images upon opening. In this case, you want to select do not export after processing, because it's going to automatically process these images and export them to the folder that we selected up here. So you don't have to say export again. This export function is for when you want to go straight to Lightroom, for example. It's going to add them to Lightroom, put them in the catalog for you automatically, or it's going to open them up in Photoshop so you can start working with the image immediately. So if you're working with one image at a time, you might use this so you can go from processing in PureRaw and then opening up in Photoshop and then start editing with Photoshop and Nick Collection, for example. But when you're batch processing, I would recommend just not doing export after processing. And then if you do want to bring these into, say, your Lightroom catalog, just do a synchronized folder function in Lightroom directly, rather than kind of going in this roundabout way here. And another reason you probably don't want to use the export to Lightroom, for example, is, trust me, it takes like just one update from Adobe to kind of mess up that particular feature. And it might be a month or two, if ever, that PureRaw is going to be able to fix that particular incompatibility. So it's best to develop a workflow without using that particular feature and just use the do not export after process. Now there's one more little checkbox down here for export with original raw files. And you don't need to check this box if you've already put your raw images onto your hard drive. But I can see a use case where if you want to process your images directly off of the SD card or a memory stick or whatever, you can process those images, get your denoised TIFF file or DNG, but also import the untouched original raw files together with those and put them into the folder that we assigned earlier in this dialog box. So if you're doing something like that, that would make sense. But otherwise, if you already have your files on your hard drive, there's no need to check this box. Now let's just go back up to the top here, back to the optics module, and I'm going to briefly talk about this. Now the lens softness checkbox here is actually for sharpening the image. And it does this sort of in an intelligent way where it identifies lenses through its optics module. Some lenses, might be a little bit softer in the corners, not as sharp as the center. And this DxO optics module will actually sharpen the edges a little more and a little bit less in the center to give you more even sharpness across the entire image. And some people have found that, they think it's too sharp or there's too much sharpening applied when they select anything here, because you do have other options here, standard, strong, and hard. Personally, I found soft works like 99% of the time for me. I don't find the images to be too sharp, but you do have the option to turn this off completely and just do sharpening yourself later in post-processing. But I think the setting for soft does a better job than I could probably do using the slider, say, in Lightroom to sharpen the image later. There's also a vignetting feature here that you can turn on and off. And as you know, some lenses can be a little darker in the corners as well. So the optics module will identify those lenses and correct for that. It's correct the darkening in the corners. Now, the only reason you might want to turn this off is maybe you like the vignetting created by the lens. Certain images, a little vignette doesn't hurt, right? It looks nice. And then we have chromatic aberration and lens distortion. And these two options I recommend you always leave on. And there's a couple exceptions to that, and I'll come back to that later. But just make sure that at least these two are on. And then I would say the first two, lens softness and vignetting, is kind of optional to taste. And then finally, we have another drop-down box here for cropping. And this, I'll come back to this when I talk about the other settings. But basically, you want to select image crop to maximum rectangle. So these are the settings that I use 99% of the time. Lens softness set to soft, vignetting on, chromatic aberration on, lens distortion on, and maximum rectangle. And I'll come back to the differences between these different settings a little bit later. Now, before we start actually processing, I'm going to just deselect these images here because I want to demonstrate the Add to Queue feature. Now, like I said, all of these images are automatically added to the queue because they're highlighted. So if I click on Process Now, and then I've made all my choices here and start processing. And then you're presented down here with a progress bar, and I can actually pause the processing here if I need to and add more images from the Lightbox, or maybe I want to do something else on my computer because, this is a very processor intensive function and it slows your computer down quite a bit. And then also I can just cancel everything here all at once. And then you'll notice that the Add to Queue button here is lit up, and we also have a Show Queue. So let's go to Show Queue. And in here, this will show you the progress. So let me go ahead and resume this, and it'll show the progress of the denoising or processing. And if I want to, I can rearrange the images so that that image will process before the rest. And be careful not to move an image that's already being in the process of processing. Like, I can't even move it actually, but I can do that if I want, some images processed before others. Let me pause this here. And I don't have to pause this. I'm just doing it to kind of slow things down for us. But let's go to hide queue. And I'm going to select some more images here. But I want to make sure I deselect these because they've already been added to the queue. If I don't deselect these, they're going to be processed again. So I'm going to deselect these and just add new ones to the queue like this and say add to queue. And then I'll use the same options I did before, but I can make changes if I need to, and I'll click add to queue here. And then if we show queue, you'll see that all those images are now added, and I can continue the process here. And again, if I want this image to be processed before the rest, I can just move this up here, and now that will be the next image in the process. Or let's say I change my mind about a certain image. If it hasn't been processed yet, I can go ahead and cancel it like that and remove it from the queue. But actually, I do want to add that image, so let me go back, and I'm going to deselect everything and add it back in. And show queue. Now when we go back to the lightbox, you'll notice that as things are getting processed, there'll be a little cyan color checkbox letting you know that that image is done. And then you can see here that it's working on this image, and this one is done, and this one with the gray checkbox is letting you know that it's waiting to be processed. And while we're in the lightbox, what I can actually do is just show the images that are waiting to be processed yet. So let me uncheck these and just say, okay, just show me the ones that are waiting to be processed. Or if I want to just look at the ones that are already done, I can click on this and then deselect the waiting process. So I know that these are done, and I can just kind of watch them as they go. But typically I like to see everything processed, unprocessed, and just use the little check boxes in the bottom left to let me know their current status. Now, I guess if you have thousands or hundreds of images, that particular filter feature will be more useful. But for the most part, I just show everything at once. All right, I've skipped ahead here because we're kind of on the last image now for processing. And another thing I want you to notice is that now it's showing the processed image file name rather than the original file name. So that's another way to kind of recognize that it has been processed. You'll also see that it has the file extension for TIFF. And if you're exporting in more than just TIFF or something other than TIFF, that'll show those files as well. And then when the processing is done, you'll get another pop-up box here. So you can go to the Explorer, which is going to take me to the folder where I saved all of these images. Or I can do View Results, or I can do Export To. And again, I don't recommend you do the Export To. This will just say Export to Lightroom or Export to Adobe. What you can do, though, actually, is you can go to View Results. And this allows you to compare, say, the original raw image versus the processed TIFF image in my case. And you can just move this slider back and forth and do the comparison. But let's pick a darker image that had some more noise in it. This one was shot at ISO 1600. So let's zoom into the shadier area, like this window here. And as I move the slider across, you can see the original raw image had a lot of noise and it's a little bit soft or blurry. But as I slide this over, we can see that the processed image is much cleaner, much sharper, and it did a really good job. And you may have noticed, I guess this is like a parallax error, but actually what this is the lens distortion correction that we applied. Now, if you didn't like the sharpening or the process that was applied here, you may want to reprocess the image, for example. Because, like I said, some people found that the sharpening is too much. I really don't have a problem with it, but let's say we want to do that. So let's close this viewer. And there's a note here that says unprocessed picture using filters available in the command bar. Okay, so we just did that. All right, so let's go ahead and reprocess this image. So we're going to highlight it there, click on Process Now, and I'm going to deactivate the lens softness, and then everything else looks the same. The only thing I'm going to change is the file renaming. And I'm going to turn this, just say off, so that I know I didn't apply any sharpening to this, and then start processing. And we'll come back to this when it's done. All right, let's go into view results. And if we zoom into that same area, you can see that it definitely took away the noise, and it did not apply any additional sharpening to the image. All it did was take out the noise and apply distortion and vignetting and all that good stuff. Now, I just wanted to touch on how long does it actually take to process some of these images. Now, my computer, for the images that are relatively low noise, like even that one at ISO 1600, it only takes 15 to 20 seconds to process each image in DXD. Of course, your mileage is going to vary, but on my higher ISO and very noisy images, I found it can take 2 to 4 minutes to process those images each. So it's really going to depend on the image, how much noise is in the image, and then also on the processing power of your computer. Another example I'll give you is, and this was from one of the forums, is one person had a 2018 Mac with the old Intel processor, an i7, I believe, and it was taking like 8 minutes to process an image on that. But when he processed the image on his MacBook, and it had the M2 processor, he said it was taking like 20 seconds. And if he enabled the Apple Neural Engine, it was only taking like 10 seconds. Now, he didn't use that at the time because he was getting a color casting when he enabled the Apple Neural Engine. But like I said, supposedly that's been fixed here in 3.3. So again, let me know in the comments below if that's the case. Now, what I want to show you now are the different cropping methods under the lens distortion option in the process module. So let me go ahead and add a image. And typically, it's easier to see on wider angle lenses. So I'm going to select that image there. And let's go ahead and process this. And I'm going to process this using each of these different options. Image crop to original ratio, maximum rectangle, and complete image, and then show you the difference between the three. All right, so I've brought in the three images with the various cropping methods applied, and the first one we're looking at here is the complete image area. So you'll notice that there's some bowing at the tops and sides, and that's because DxO is applying their optical corrections to this lens to, keep the line straight and stuff. But it's not cropping out any of the pixels that were captured by the sensor. So we're seeing every single pixel captured. And if we look over here at the dimensions, we're at 5184 by 3878. So that's all the pixels that this sensor can pick up, less, the optical correction areas here. Now let's look at the maximum rectangle. And, obviously what this is doing is just cropping out all of those areas that did not have pixels, but, keeping as many pixels as it can that were captured by the sensor. And if we look at the dimensions of this, we're at 5352 by 3888. So keep that number in mind. We're going to do a little math here in a minute. And then the last one is the original ratio. And you can see a slight change here, but what this is doing is actually cropping the image to the exact 4:3 ratio that my sensor is to give me this image. So if we look at the dimensions here, you can see that we're at 5184 by 3888, which is the original dimensions that the camera normally puts out. Now, if we do a little math and compare how many pixels did we gain when we choose maximum rectangle, because this image here, maximum rectangle, actually is not an exact 3:4 ratio. It's just like a 3.1 by 4.1, whatever it is. So if we bring up the calculator here and we type in 5352 and we subtract out the 4:3 ratio here, so we do minus 5184, we get 168, and then let's multiply that by the width, 3888. So we're actually capturing 653,000 more pixels, or 0.65 megapixels more image than we were otherwise when we used the maximum rectangle versus the original ratio. Now this has come up in the forums where some people like to actually set up layers where they have their original raw image on one layer, and then they have the PureRaw images on another layer. But the problem they're running into is that the optically corrected PureRaw image doesn't overlay or match exactly with the original raw image because that hasn't been corrected for distortion. So what you would do in that situation is when you go to process, you would deselect the lens distortion, maybe even deselect lens softness, and only apply the vignetting and chromatic aberration and start processing that. So let's do that and see if that works. All right, so I brought in the two images. This is the original raw image layer, and I turned off the optical corrections on the Adobe Camera Raw import. And then just above that, I inserted the PureRaw output with the optical corrections turned off, but noise reduction and chromatic aberration and vignetting still turned on, but no sharpening. And if I select these two layers and then do edit and auto align, and we'll just click auto and see what happens. And looks like there was some slight movement there, but let me turn off the top layer and turn it back on. So you can see when I turn that PureRaw layer on, I did get rid of all the vignetting still and whatever other minor aberrations there might have been. And then when I turn this off, it looks okay. It looks like it lines up perfectly. If it's off by a pixel here and there, it would be very difficult to tell. And if that's important, you probably still can't overlay these images on top of each other. If you're talking about you need precision within a couple of pixels. But I think for most intents and purposes, you'll be perfectly fine overlaying pure raw images to the original raw file with all optical corrections turned off, but still do the denoising. Now I'm just going to touch briefly on using PureRaw as a plugin to Lightroom. So instead of using PureRaw's Lightbox to sort of sort and cull your images, you would just use the Lightroom catalog here. So what I do is, you select whatever camera you want. Make sure you select on RAW when you're doing your filtering under the metadata. And then just select the images you want to process. So you can select one or select multiple. So if we select multiple, we just go to File, Plugin Extras, and then Process with DxO PureRaw. And then from here, it's going to be fairly derivative of everything else we've done in the video at this point, where we get the dialog box, we make our selections here, and it's going to bring up the last selections that we used. You want to make sure you adjust these to what you need in this scenario. And then you do the start processing. And all you're going to get is this dialog where it just shows you the processing. And at this point, when this finishes, it's going to automatically bring these images back into your catalog, under the folder that we assigned or within the same folder if we set it up that way. So you don't have control to say add more to the queue at this point. You really need to wait till this is done. And but other than that, it's pretty much the same. All right, and then once the images are finished processing, like I said, it brings them in automatically into the catalog and actually creates a filter collection here called DxO PureRaw 3, and then puts it into a dated folder for you automatically. Of course, these files are still in the original folder that we set up in the previous dialog box. So if I right-click on this image and say go to Folder and Library, you can see it goes all the way back to my Pictures folder and my subfolder that I created earlier, PureRaw 3. So that's where the images are going to reside. And then finally, the third way to use DxO PureRaw is you can access it actually directly through your File Explorer. Now this has a lot of limitations to it, but what you can do is you just open up a folder maybe that you want to process images, and then I'll type in the search box .orf, which is the file extension for my raw images on my camera. Again, it might be like .nef for yours if you have a Nikon. And then I'll just select one of the images here, right click on it, and then I actually have to go to Show More, and then I'll have the options here, process using Deep Prime, and then a submenu of what I want to export it as, process with Deep Prime XD, and again, how I want to export this. So if I choose, for example, TIFF 16-bit, you'll see that this processing dialog pops up, but not the dialog box with all the different options that we had before. So now that it's done processing, it's going to write that file back to the original image folder. So all I have to do is type in over here in the search box .tif, and it should come up, and yeah, there it is right there. And you can see that it has the suffix extension DxO Deep Prime XD. So basically, because you don't get that dialog box with all the different options and checkboxes, it's going to use all the default settings. So it's going to apply optical corrections. It's going to apply sharpening. You're not going to be able to customize the file name, and it's always going to write it back to the original folder. So you lose a lot of control when you do it this way, but it is an option. All right, and that's everything I know about DxO PureRaw. And before I go, I want to thank the members over at the mu43.com forums, as well as the Olympus E group across the pond in the UK, for giving me feedback to help create this video. It's greatly appreciated. And if you're not a member there yet, I'm going to put links down below to those forums because it's a great community of Micro Four Thirds users like myself. And there's a ton of information. Everyone there is very helpful and really nice. So definitely check that out. And if you have any questions for me, feel free to leave them down in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer them as always. And if you found this video helpful, consider buying me a coffee or making a small donation in the links below, because they help me to continue making videos like this for you, and they are greatly appreciated. So until next time, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.